There was something undeniably eerie about working the night shift at the old hospital on the edge of town. Its dull, off-white hallways were perpetually filled with strange noises, whispers, distant footfalls, and occasional mechanical hums that made your skin prickle. For the night staff, this wasn't new, but there was always something deeply unsettling when the last of the day shift nurses walked out, leaving the place cloaked in silence. Sarah was a young nurse on her third night shift of the week, exhausted but eager to finish the last few hours. She was assigned to the fourth floor, rumored among staff to be haunted. The entire floor was empty, a transition area between the emergency room and the long-term care units. Most patients never even stayed on the fourth floor unless the other wings were full. She often wondered why they didn't just close it down. Around 1 a.m., Sarah was making her rounds, checking in on a few patients in other parts of the building, when she heard it, a faint crying sound, like a child's whimpering, coming from the hallway. Frowning, she turned towards the noise. Her footsteps echoed in the silence as she followed the sound down the hallway. With each step, the crying grew softer, almost like it was leading her deeper into the maze of rooms and dimly lit corridors. Finally, she stopped outside room 409, an old patient room that hadn't been used in years. She reached for the doorknob, only to hesitate when she saw it move ever so slightly, as if someone on the other side were slowly twisting it from the inside. Every nerve in her body screamed to turn and run, but her hand was frozen on the handle. When the door finally creaked open, the crying stopped. She peered inside and saw nothing, just an empty bed with a clean white sheet, an old IV stand, and a chair in the corner. Breathing a sigh of relief, she stepped in to get a better look. Maybe she just imagined it. Then she saw it. A faint, child-sized handprint smeared on the wall, just above the bed's headboard. The print was fresh, as if made only moments ago. Her stomach tightened, and she backed out of the room, her eyes never leaving that handprint. As soon as she closed the door behind her, the crying started again, softer but more desperate. It sounded like it was right behind her. She didn't dare look back and instead forced herself to walk quickly down the hall. When she returned to the nurse's station, she tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just her imagination. But as she sat down, she glanced at the security monitor. Each floor was displayed in small, grainy, black and white screens. Room 409 was visible in one of them. And there, sitting on the edge of the bed, was the faint outline of a small child, a little girl with long dark hair hanging over her face, wearing a hospital gown. The screen flickered, and she was gone. A cold sweat broke out on Sarah's skin, and she grabbed her phone, ready to call security. But as she dialed, she heard footsteps behind her. She whirled around, only to find herself face to face with one of the janitors, an older man named Carl who had worked there for decades. "You look like you've seen a ghost." He chuckled, but his expression shifted when he saw her face. "Are you all right? Did you hear the crying from room 409? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Carl's face paled, and he looked away, mumbling under his breath. "I told him to close off that floor," he said, almost as if talking to himself. "What do you mean?" Sarah pressed. Carl glanced around, lowering his voice. "Years ago, there was a little girl. She was really sick, terminal. She spent her last days on the fourth floor in room 409. They say her spirit never left. People hear her crying, see her handprints on the walls, sometimes even catch glimpses of her on the security cameras. That's why no one wants to work the fourth floor shift." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as Carl continued. Once, a nurse went in there late at night. She didn't know the story either. They found her the next morning, sitting on the floor, just staring at the wall, mumbling to herself. She never came back to work. Couldn't speak a word after that. Sarah forced herself to laugh, hoping it would ease the tension. "You're just trying to scare me, right?" Carl didn't smile. Instead, he looked at her with something between pity and fear. "I wish I was." That was enough for Sarah. She tried to focus on her work, telling herself it was all just stories. But as the hours dragged on, the noises continued. She heard soft humming, a child's laugh, faint knocks against the walls, and each time she looked around, there was no one there. Around 4 a.m., Sarah decided to make one last round. She avoided room 409, instead heading to the opposite end of the floor. She walked quickly, her eyes darting around, her ears tuned to any sound. But as she passed the hallway mirror, she froze. In the reflection, she saw herself, and just behind her, the figure of a young girl with sunken eyes, dark hair tangled around her face, and a thin, pale hand reaching out towards Sarah's shoulder. Sarah's scream echoed through the empty hallways. She turned, expecting the girl to be right there, but the hallway was empty. Her heart raced, and she stumbled backward, knocking over a supply cart as she fled down the corridor. The morning staff found her sitting at the nurse's station, pale and shaking, her eyes fixed on the security monitor. When they reviewed the footage, they saw her walking down the hallway, turning toward the mirror, and then backing away, alone. But as she ran, the camera caught one last frame of a small figure standing at the end of the hallway, watching her go, before fading back into the shadows. Sarah never returned to the night shift. And now, every new nurse who works on the 4th floor hears whispers about the girl in room 409, still waiting. Her cries echoing through the empty halls, waiting for someone to stay with her through the long, dark hours of the night. There's a certain quiet that settles in late at night when you're working at a gas station on the edge of town. The dimly lit pumps cast long shadows. The hum of the fluorescent lights mixes with the occasional chirp of crickets, and if you listen close enough, you'd swear you hear faint whispers carried on the night breeze. Henry had been working there for a year, and he'd grown used to the usual quiet of the night shift. But one night, things were different. Very different. It was around 2 a.m., and Henry was alone in the store. The night had been dead slow, with only a few truckers coming in for coffee and snacks. He was almost dozing off when the bell over the door chimed, announcing a new customer. Henry looked up, expecting to see another tired traveler, but instead a young woman stood just inside the door, dripping wet. Her hair was matted to her face, her clothes soaked and clinging to her body as if she'd just come out of the rain. The strange thing was, it hadn't rained in days. "Can I help you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The woman didn't respond. She just stared at him, her eyes hollow and distant, like she wasn't really seeing him. Her skin was pale, almost blue in the harsh fluorescent lighting. "Miss, are you all right?" He tried again, taking a step forward. She suddenly jerked her head up to look at him, and he felt a chill spread through his body. Her eyes were wide, too wide, as if they were forced open by some unnatural fear or pain. "Do you have a phone?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, but clear enough that it cut through the silence of the store. Henry pointed toward the wall where the store phone hung. She walked slowly over to it, leaving a trail of wet footprints on the tile floor. He watched her pick up the receiver, but instead of dialing, she just held it to her ear, staring straight ahead. Her lips were moving, but no sound came out. Suddenly, she dropped the phone and turned to look at him again. "Can you help me?" she asked, her voice hollow. Sure, I can call someone for you," Henry stammered, reaching for his cell phone. But as he glanced back up, she was gone. The door hadn't chimed, and the store was silent. There were still wet footprints on the floor leading to the phone, but no sign of the woman. Feeling his heart pound, he went to the door and looked outside. Nothing but darkness and the empty gas station lot. He chalked it up to exhaustion, maybe even a hallucination. After all, the night shift did weird things to people. But a few minutes later, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of crying coming from somewhere inside the store. Henry's skin prickled as he strained to listen. The crying was faint, but it seemed to be coming from behind the aisles. He walked cautiously, following the sound, his footsteps echoing on the tile floor. The crying grew louder, more desperate as he approached the back of the store. He turned the corner of the aisle, expecting to see someone crouched there, but once again he found nothing. He was about to walk away when something caught his eye. The bottom of the freezer door was smeared with water, and there, just above the handle, was a single handprint, fresh and dripping, as if someone had just pressed their wet palm against the glass. His heart skipped a beat. He glanced around the store, but it was empty. The crying had stopped, leaving him in an oppressive silence. Trying to calm himself, he returned to the counter and picked up his phone. Maybe he should call someone, a friend, the police, anyone, just to reassure himself that he wasn't going crazy. But as he dialed, the phone in his hand went dead. He looked down at it, realizing with a sinking feeling that the battery was completely drained despite having charged it earlier. Suddenly, the store lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that stretched and twisted across the aisles. He was about to walk to the back room to check the breaker when he heard it again. The faint sound of crying, but now it was closer, as if it were just on the other side of the counter. "Hello?" he called out, his voice wavering. No response, only the soft, pitiful sound of crying. With a sense of dread, he peered over the counter, half expecting to see the woman crouched on the floor. Instead, he saw a pair of wet footprints leading from behind the counter to the store exit. He hadn't heard the door chime, hadn't seen anyone leave, yet the footprints were fresh, still glistening on the tile. Henry felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to abandon the shift and get out of there. But he forced himself to stay, reminding himself that he was probably just tired, that it was all in his head. Then he saw it, a figure in the reflection of the glass cooler door behind him. She was standing right behind him, her face inches from his own, her dark, hollow eyes locked onto his. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque, silent scream, her jaw unnaturally wide. He spun around, but no one was there. The store was empty, the lights flickering even more erratically now. He could feel her presence, though, death like a cold weight pressing down on him. He backed away toward the exit, his heart pounding, his hands shaking. As he reached for the door, the bell chimed, and he heard her voice, clear as day, whispering in his ear, "Help me." He bolted out of the store, not stopping until he was halfway down the deserted road, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He glanced back, expecting to see her standing in the doorway, watching him. But the gas station was empty, the lights steady once again, as if nothing had happened. He didn't return to work for a week, and when he did, he learned that he wasn't the first to experience the strange occurrences at the gas station. Years before, a young woman had been found drowned in a lake not far from there. She had been last seen at the gas station asking for help, but no one had believed her. Since then, people said her spirit returned, seeking help from anyone who would listen, her cries echoing through the empty aisles late at night. Henry never worked the night shift again, and he never forgot the look in her eyes. The desperate, haunted look of someone trapped in a place they could never leave. Now, whenever he passes by that lonely gas station, he feels her presence, watching, waiting, hoping that someday someone will finally answer her call for help. There are some places you just shouldn't go, especially at night. Sam learned this the hard way when he took the night shift at the local warehouse on the outskirts of town. It wasn't a normal warehouse. It had been abandoned for years, bought recently by a company that wanted it cleaned up before they moved in. All he had to do was walk through the warehouse hourly, check the locks, and report any odd sounds. Easy money, he'd thought. The warehouse was massive, with towering shelves and rows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. During the day, sunlight poured through the few grimy windows high above, but at night, the place transformed into a cavern of shadows and echoes. It was Sam's third night on the job, and he was already used to the creaks and groans of the old building settling. But that night, as he was making his rounds, something felt off. As he walked through the rows of empty shelving, he heard the faintest sound like a whisper carried through the cold, stagnant air. He froze, straining his ears. It was so faint, he almost convinced himself it was the wind. Then he heard it again, clearer this time, a child's laugh, soft and sinister, coming from somewhere deep in the warehouse. Sam shook his head, forcing himself to think logically. No one was supposed to be here. He was the only person in the building. Maybe a stray animal had wandered in and gotten trapped, but the sound was undeniably human. He continued down the rows, his flashlight flickering as he moved deeper into the building. The laughter echoed again, bouncing off the concrete walls, closer now. He felt a chill creep up his spine. He was tempted to turn back, but the uneasy curiosity pushed him forward. As he turned a corner, he caught sight of something strange. A single wooden rocking chair sitting in the middle of the aisle, facing away from him. It was an odd sight, as though someone had placed it there deliberately, but the warehouse had been cleared of furniture long ago. And yet here it was, creaking ever so slightly as if someone had just been sitting in it. His flashlight wavered, casting shadows that seemed to dance and sway around the chair. As he got closer, he noticed that the wood was old and scratched, as if it had been used for years. Dust floated in the air, and the place smelled of mold and decay, but the chair looked freshly polished, like someone had been taking care of it. "Hello?" He called out, his voice echoing in the darkness. He half expected no response, but then he heard it. The same child's laughter, soft and taunting, right behind him. He spun around, heart hammering in his chest, but there was nothing there, just the empty, darkened aisles stretching endlessly into the gloom. When he turned back, the rocking chair was gone. The space where it had been was empty, like it had never been there at all. Feeling a prickling unease, Sam backed up, flashlight sweeping the shelves. Suddenly, he felt something cold brush against his arm, like an icy hand. He gasped and stumbled backward, pointing the flashlight around him. There was nothing there, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of someone, or something, standing just out of sight. He pulled out his radio, his voice shaking as he called his manager. "Hey, Tom, I'm getting some weird stuff here. Could be kids sneaking in or maybe an animal, but I think I need some backup." There was a long silence, then a crackling reply. "Sam, I told you. We don't use radios in that building." Sam's blood ran cold. The radio signal cut out abruptly, leaving only static, and he heard a soft, chilling voice whisper his name, the same childlike voice. "Sam," it called, drawing the word out slowly, making his skin crawl. He dropped the radio, stumbling as he backed away, nearly tripping over a stack of old crates. His flashlight flickered wildly, then went out entirely, leaving him in complete darkness. He could feel the oppressive weight of the silence pressing down on him, his own breath loud and ragged in his ears. Then he felt it, a hand, small and cold, wrapping around his wrist. His breath caught as he looked down, but the darkness was so complete he couldn't see anything. He tried to pull his arm back, but the grip was unyielding, ice-cold fingers tightening around his wrist, holding him in place. A faint blue glow began to light up the aisle ahead of him. He looked up, and in the dim, unnatural light, he saw her. A little girl, no more than 6 or 7, with long, matted hair and empty, dark eyes that seemed to swallow the light. She was wearing a thin, torn nightgown, her skin pale and almost translucent. She was smiling, but it wasn't a child's smile. It was something cold, empty, and deeply wrong. "You're not supposed to be here," she whispered, her voice echoing in his mind like it was coming from every corner of the warehouse. Sam's heart pounded, his mind racing for a way out. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The girl tilted her head, her hollow eyes never leaving his. "You came here to stay?" she asked, her voice lilting in a sing-song tone. Sam shook his head, backing up, his body trembling, but he felt something solid behind him, a wall that hadn't been there before. The cold grip on his wrist released, but he found himself frozen, unable to move, unable to look away from her. The blue glow intensified, filling the space around her. Shadows writhed and shifted, forming shapes, figures, other faces, hollow and expressionless, emerging from the darkness, all staring at him with the same empty gaze. "No," Sam managed to gasp, his voice barely a whisper. "No, please." The figures moved closer, surrounding him, their faces twisted in silent screams, their eyes empty and accusing. He felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if something were squeezing his heart, pulling him into the darkness, into the cold void that had consumed them all. The last thing he saw was the little girl's smile, widening as she whispered, "Now, you'll stay with us." The next morning, Tom arrived to start his shift and found Sam's car in the parking lot, but there was no sign of him inside the building. When he checked the security footage, he saw nothing but empty aisles and dim lights flickering, with no trace of Sam's last round. As he walked down the aisles, calling out for his missing coworker, he stopped dead in his tracks when he spotted something unusual. In the middle of the aisle, perfectly positioned, was an old wooden rocking chair, gently rocking back and forth, as if someone had just been sitting in it. And just above it, faint but unmistakable, was the sound of a child's laughter echoing through the empty warehouse. Working as a security guard in an old, desolate high-rise building wasn't exactly Mark's dream job, but it paid the bills. He was assigned to the night shift, patrolling each floor, checking locks, making sure no one had snuck in. The building had been empty for years, once a busy office space, but abandoned after a string of unexplained incidents that people didn't like to talk about. He'd heard the rumors, but Mark didn't believe in ghosts or haunted buildings. That was until his 3rd night on the job. The building was quiet, except for the hum of old fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of settling floors. Mark's rounds usually started on the top floor. Then he'd work his way down. He carried only a flashlight, his radio, and a clipboard. It was the silence that bothered him the most, the kind that felt heavy, like it was pressing against his chest. It was around 2 a.m. when he first heard it. A faint sound of typing somewhere down the hallway on the 8th floor. He frowned, his grip tightening on the flashlight. The floor was supposed to be empty, completely cleared of furniture. Curious, he walked toward the sound. As he approached, the typing stopped, leaving an echoing silence in its wake. "Hello?" he called, his voice bouncing down the empty hall. There was no response, just the faint hum of the overhead lights. He shrugged it off, figuring it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But as he turned to leave, he noticed something odd. A light was on in the corner office, a room he was sure had been dark just minutes before. He hesitated, the hair on the back of his neck standing up. The office was at the end of the hallway, with a frosted glass door that cast an eerie glow onto the floor outside. Mark could see shadows moving inside, shapes shifting, almost like someone was pacing back and forth. He steadied himself, telling himself it was probably just a broken light sensor, or maybe another guard who'd snuck in to take a nap. He pushed open the door, his flashlight cutting through the dim light. The room was empty. It was completely barren, nothing but a layer of dust coating the floor and windows. He stood there for a moment, frozen, his heart pounding. But as he was about to turn around, he felt a chill, a sudden ice-cold draft that seemed to come from nowhere. The cold seeped into his skin, chilling him to the bone. And then he saw it, faint but unmistakable. The dust on the floor had been disturbed, forming a trail of footprints leading to the desk in the corner. His throat tightened as he took a shaky step closer. He noticed something even stranger. There was an old, broken-down typewriter on the desk, a relic that should have been removed with the rest of the furniture years ago. He could have sworn it hadn't been there moments ago. The chair in front of the desk was slightly pulled out as though someone had been sitting there, typing away. And then, before he could process what was happening, the typewriter sprang to life, its keys clacking loudly, typing out words faster and faster, each keystroke echoing in the empty room. Mark stumbled back, his mind racing, trying to comprehend the sight in front of him. He took a deep breath, inching forward to see what was being typed. The words appeared, one by one, stark against the yellowed paper. Leave. Mark's heart pounded, and he could feel cold sweat beating on his forehead. He took a step back, ready to bolt, but the typewriter continued, the keys clacking away with a speed that was almost furious. You don't belong here. The words sent a chill down his spine. He turned to leave, but as he reached the door, it slammed shut in front of him, locking him in. He tugged at the handle, his heart racing, but it wouldn't budge. He banged on the door, calling for help, his voice echoing in the dark, empty hallway. Then he heard it, a soft whisper, close to his ear, though he was alone. Mark? The voice was cold, hollow, almost like it was drifting from somewhere far away. He froze, every muscle in his body tensed as he felt an icy breath on his neck. He didn't dare turn around, but he could sense someone, something, standing right behind him. The voice came again, closer this time. Why are you here? He forced himself to turn, his flashlight trembling in his hand. But when he did, the room was empty. Only the typewriter remained, the paper on it now blank, as if it had never typed those words at all. Desperate to get out, Mark turned back to the door, yanking on the handle with all his strength. This time, it gave way, and he stumbled into the hallway, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He ran down the corridor, not daring to look back, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He made it to the stairwell and sprinted down, his pulse racing. But as he reached the 7th floor, he heard the faint sound of typing again, coming from the floor above him. He picked up his pace, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste to get out. When he finally burst through the front doors and into the cool night air, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. He looked back at the building, expecting to see that eerie glow in the 8th floor window, but the building was dark, silent, almost as if it were watching him. He called his manager and told him he was done, that he wouldn't be coming back. The manager sounded understanding, like this wasn't the first time they'd heard such a story. When he hung up, Mark felt a strange sense of relief. He was free from whatever was in that building. But the relief didn't last. That night, as he lay in bed, he heard it. the faint sound of typing coming from somewhere just outside his bedroom door. It was slow, deliberate, each keystroke punctuating the silence. He sat up, his heart pounding, his skin prickling with fear. The typing continued, growing louder, closer. And then a piece of paper slid under his door. Trembling, he reached down and picked it up, his hands shaking as he read the words scrawled across it in dark, almost angry letters. "You can never leave." The typewriter clacked on, filling the room with its relentless, maddening rhythm as the whisper echoed in his ears once more. "Why are you here?" The last thing Nora expected when she accepted a job as a hotel night clerk was to end up fearing for her life. The Evergreen Inn was an old, elegant hotel with high ceilings, rich red carpets, and creaky wooden floors. By day, it was beautiful, almost comforting. But by night, it became something else entirely, a place where shadows seemed to stretch and move, and silence crept in like a fog. It was her second week on the job, and she had already started hearing strange things from other staff members. Stories about a particular guest who would sometimes appear in room 308, a guest no one could explain. Room 308 had been closed off for years. The official story was that the room was being renovated, but everyone knew it was more than that. No one was allowed inside, not even for cleaning. One rainy night, with the hotel nearly empty, Nora was behind the front desk, lost in a book, when she noticed something odd on the security monitor. In the camera feed from the third floor, she caught sight of a man standing at the end of the hall, right near room 308. He was tall, with dark, hollow eyes and a long coat that seemed almost too thin for his frame, like he'd stepped out of another time. She frowned, reaching for the intercom. "Excuse me, sir," she said, hoping he'd hear her through the third-floor speakers. "The third floor is currently off-limits to guests. Please return to your room." The man didn't move. He just stared, motionless, as though he couldn't hear her at all. Feeling a surge of unease, Nora watched him closely. A few moments passed, and then the man reached for the doorknob to room 308. His hand lingered there, hovering over it, and then, with a slow, deliberate twist, he opened the door and disappeared inside. A cold chill ran down her spine. She knew that door was supposed to be locked. It hadn't been opened in years. She took a deep breath, debating whether to investigate. Finally, against her better judgment, she grabbed the master key and made her way up the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. The third floor was dark, the lights flickering as she stepped out of the stairwell. She walked down the hall, her heart pounding with each step, until she stood in front of room 308. The door was slightly ajar. She hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But something compelled her forward, a strange, almost magnetic pull. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was shrouded in shadows, thick and heavy. It smelled faintly of mildew and something else, something metallic. She swept her flashlight across the room, and that's when she saw it. The man was standing by the window, his back to her. He was impossibly still, his head slightly tilted as if he were looking out at something far away. "Sir?" she managed, her voice barely a whisper. The man slowly turned to face her, and as his gaze locked onto hers, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. His face was pale, gaunt, his eyes sunken and lifeless, like they belonged to a corpse. But what truly terrified her was his expression, his mouth stretched into a twisted smile, wide and unnatural, almost as if it were being forced. "I was waiting," he whispered, his voice thin and hollow, echoing in the small room. Nora stumbled back, instinctively reaching for the door handle, but her hand found only empty air. The door had closed behind her, and when she looked back, the man was gone. The room was empty, as though he'd never been there at all. She fumbled for the door, pulling it open, and nearly tripped over her own feet as she raced down the hallway, heart pounding, mind spinning. She ran back to the lobby, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what she'd seen. Just as she was beginning to calm herself, the phone on the front desk rang, the sharp sound cutting through the silence. She jumped, staring at the blinking light on the phone. The call was coming from room 308. Her hands shook as she reached for the receiver, lifting it to her ear. "Hello?" she whispered. There was a long, chilling silence on the other end, followed by the sound of breathing, slow, labored, and unmistakably close. And then, in a voice so faint she could barely hear it, the man's voice came through. "You shouldn't have opened the door." She slammed the phone down, her hands trembling. The lights in the lobby flickered, casting strange, distorted shadows across the walls. She could still feel his gaze, watching her from somewhere just out of sight. The rest of the night passed in a haze of terror, her eyes glued to the security monitor, watching for any sign of movement near room 308. But it remained quiet, the third-floor hallway empty. She waited, her heart pounding, until the morning staff arrived. She didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe her? A few days later, as she was getting ready for another shift, she received a call from the hotel's maintenance crew. They'd gone into room 308 to fix a wiring issue and found something chilling. A photograph tucked under the old mattress, one they couldn't explain. It was a black and white picture, worn and faded, of a man in a long coat with dark, hollow eyes and a twisted, unnatural smile. The date on the back of the photograph read 1928. Nora quit her job at the hotel that very day, but sometimes, late at night, she still hears the sound of the phone ringing, and when she dreams, she can feel his cold gaze watching her, always waiting for her to open the door once again. Ella's new job at a sleepy old hospital was supposed to be easy money. She was assigned to work the night shift on a mostly empty floor, the third floor, where they only kept patients in overflow situations. The hospital was old and a bit run down, with dim lighting and peeling walls, but it was quiet work, and that's exactly what Ella wanted. Little did she know that this night she'd come face to face with something beyond her imagination. It started around midnight. Ella was stationed at the nurse's desk, reading a magazine under the cold fluorescent lights. As she flipped a page, she noticed something odd. A light had turned on in room 304. Room 304 was supposed to be empty. She'd checked the whole floor at the beginning of her shift, and the beds were all empty. She frowned, setting down her magazine and heading down the hallway, her footsteps echoing. As she neared room 304, she could see the soft glow of the light under the door. Cautiously, she pushed it open, expecting to find an empty room. Instead, a frail-looking woman sat on the bed, staring out the window. She was pale, with wispy white hair, and her hospital gown looked faded and thin. Her eyes were fixed on something outside, but Ella couldn't see what. She cleared her throat, feeling a strange chill creeping up her spine. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Ella asked, stepping a bit closer. The woman didn't respond. She continued to stare out the window, her lips moving silently, as if she were whispering something to herself. A strange feeling washed over Ella. Something about this woman didn't feel right. She took another cautious step forward. "Ma'am," she repeated softly. Finally, the woman turned to face her, and Ella's blood ran cold. The woman's eyes were glassy and unfocused, like she was staring right through Ella. Her skin was so pale it was almost translucent, and her lips moved slowly, forming words Ella couldn't quite make out. Before Ella could ask anything else, the woman whispered something strange. "They told me not to leave," she murmured. "But I waited. So long." A shiver raced down Ella's spine, and she took an involuntary step back. Just then, the overhead lights in the hallway flickered, casting strange, erratic shadows into the room. Ella looked around, feeling suddenly isolated. When she turned back to the woman, her bed was empty. Ella blinked, her heart pounding. The woman was gone, as if she'd vanished into thin air. The bed looked untouched, the sheets neatly folded, as though no one had been there at all. Trying to keep herself calm, Ella stepped back into the hallway, clutching her chest. She told herself she was tired, that her mind was playing tricks. But as she turned to head back to the nurse's station, she heard it. A soft, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. She whipped around, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. At the end of the hall, just barely visible in the flickering light, was the same woman. But this time her head was hanging low, her hair obscuring her face, and she was moving slowly toward Ella, dragging one foot behind her. "Please, I waited so long," the woman whispered, her voice echoing in the silence. Ella backed up, her heart racing. The woman's voice grew louder, a desperate, hollow whisper that seemed to fill the entire hallway. "They said I could leave, but I'm still here, still waiting." Ella stumbled backward, barely able to tear her gaze away from the woman. She turned and ran, her footsteps pounding as she made her way back to the nurse's station, where she grabbed the phone, her hands trembling as she dialed for security. But before the call could go through, she heard it again, the dragging sound coming from just outside the station door. She dropped the phone, staring at the doorway as the flickering lights cast eerie shadows on the walls. Slowly, the woman's face appeared, peering around the corner, her glassy eyes fixated on Ella. "Why won't they let me leave?" she asked, her voice a wretched whisper. Ella screamed, backing up until she hit the wall, her breath coming in short gasps. She closed her eyes, telling herself it wasn't real, that it was just a hallucination, but the sound of the woman's labored breathing was all around her, filling the room. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Ella opened her eyes, and the woman was gone. The hallway was empty, the flickering lights steady once again. She looked around, her mind racing, trying to process what had happened. But everything was still, as though the hospital itself was holding its breath. Shaken, Ella gathered her things and left the building, unable to finish her shift. The next day, she returned, hoping to find some logical explanation for what she'd seen. Curious, she asked an older nurse about room 304, hesitantly mentioning the woman she'd seen. The nurse's face grew pale, her hands shaking slightly as she told Ella the story. Years ago, a patient named Mrs. Winters had been assigned to room 304. She was a long-term resident, suffering from a rare illness that kept her bedridden. Toward the end, she'd grown obsessed with the idea of leaving, convinced that the doctors were keeping her there against her will. One night, she passed away, whispering her last words to the nurse on duty, "I'll leave when they let me." Since then, multiple night staff had reported seeing her, a pale figure wandering the third floor, always looking for a way out. Ella left the hospital that day, never to return. But sometimes, when she thinks back on that night, she can still hear the faint, dragging sound of footsteps in the dark and the woman's hollow whisper, "Why won't they let me leave?" Liam had always thought of himself as a skeptic, the type who didn't believe in ghosts or haunted buildings. So when he was offered a night shift security job at Blackwood Cemetery, he shrugged and took it. A cemetery was as quiet a workplace as one could find, and he figured his nights would be uneventful. But from the very first night, he felt something was wrong. The cemetery was enormous, a sprawling maze of headstones, statues, and mausoleums dating back over 100 years. Most graves were old and forgotten, many with inscriptions worn away by time. And in the middle of it all stood the caretaker's shack, a small building where Liam would sit and monitor the grounds through a set of outdated security cameras. It was his second night on the job when he first heard it. It started as a faint tapping sound, just outside the shack's door. Tap, 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 like someone lightly knocking. At first, he brushed it off as his imagination or an animal scurrying by, but the tapping grew louder, persistent, as though someone or something was trying to get his attention. He opened the door and shone his flashlight out into the darkness. The cold night air settled around him, thick with mist. Nothing moved, no animals, no people. Just rows and rows of silent graves stretching out into the darkness. With a shrug, he went back inside, but the tapping didn't stop. It continued, steady and rhythmic, and now it seemed to be coming from the roof, as if someone were walking across it. He felt a shiver crawl up his spine. The shack was old, barely big enough to fit him and his equipment, and the idea of someone, or something, on the roof filled him with dread. He called his supervisor, a gruff older man who'd worked at the cemetery for years. When Liam mentioned the noise, the supervisor fell silent. "You're near the old monument, aren't you?" The supervisor finally asked, his voice low. "Yeah. Why?" Liam asked, confused. The supervisor sighed. "Look, you're not the first guard to report strange things at night. Just stay away from the monument, all right? Don't go near it. If you hear anything strange, ignore it." The call ended, leaving Liam with more questions than answers. He was tempted to ignore his supervisor's warning, but something in the man's tone gave him pause. Whatever was out there didn't feel right, but the tapping grew louder, and he felt an odd urge to find the source. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the shack, his breath misting in the cool air. The cemetery was deathly silent, save for the sound of his own footsteps crunching on the gravel. He followed the noise, which seemed to pull him further and further into the oldest part of the cemetery, toward the old monument. The monument was massive, a towering obelisk that loomed over the graves like a silent sentinel. Weathered and cracked, it bore no name, no date, only strange symbols carved into the stone, worn smooth over decades. As he approached, the tapping stopped. The silence was overwhelming, heavy with an unnatural stillness, and then he saw her. A woman stood just in front of the monument, dressed in a pale, flowing gown. She was facing away from him, her hair hanging down in tangled strands, her posture unnaturally rigid. She didn't move, didn't turn to face him. She just stood there, her head tilted slightly, as if listening for something. Liam's breath caught in his throat. The woman was barefoot, her skin so pale it seemed to glow in the faint moonlight. He couldn't understand what she was doing here, who she was, or why she seemed to appear out of nowhere. But something about her presence filled him with an overwhelming sense of dread. "Ma'am?" he called out, his voice wavering. The woman didn't respond, didn't acknowledge him at all. And then with a slow, mechanical movement, she turned her head slightly, just enough that he could see her face. Her eyes were hollow, dark, as though they were endless pits. Her mouth stretched into a twisted, unnatural smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. And then she whispered, her voice so faint it was almost lost in the wind. "Have you come to join me?" Liam stumbled back, his heart racing. He turned to run, but his feet seemed frozen to the ground, as though something were holding him in place. He felt a cold, invisible force pulling him toward her, the air thickening around him, suffocating him. The woman took a step forward, her movements slow and jerky, as though she were a puppet being controlled by unseen strings. Her smile grew wider, her eyes narrowing as she continued to approach. He struggled against the invisible force, finally breaking free with a gasp. He turned and bolted, sprinting through the rows of graves, his flashlight bouncing wildly. Behind him, he could hear her footsteps, dragging along the ground, getting closer with each passing second. And her voice followed him, whispering his name, over and over. "Liam, Liam, you can't leave." He made it back to the shack, slamming the door behind him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He grabbed the phone, desperate to call his supervisor, but there was no dial tone. The line was dead. As he tried to catch his breath, he noticed something strange on the security monitor. The camera feed showed the rows of graves, empty and still, except for the figure of the woman. She stood just outside the shack, her hollow eyes staring directly at the camera, directly at him, as though she knew he was watching. Slowly, she raised one hand and placed it against the window, pressing her pale fingers against the glass. Her mouth moved, forming silent words, but Liam couldn't make them out. All he could do was watch, frozen with terror. The lights in the shack flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. And then, in the reflection on the monitor, he saw her face staring back at him, just inches away, her dark eyes wide with a terrible hunger. She leaned in close, her cold breath brushing against his ear as she whispered, "You belong with us now." The lights went out, plunging the shack into darkness. The last thing Liam heard was the soft, rhythmic tapping of her fingers against the window, growing louder, faster, until it filled the room. When the morning shift arrived, they found the shack empty, the door wide open. The security cameras had recorded nothing but static after midnight. Liam was never seen again. But some say that, on quiet nights, you can still hear faint footsteps echoing through Blackwood Cemetery, and the soft tapping of fingers against the caretaker's shack window, as though something or someone is waiting, hoping for someone new to join them. Lily worked the night shift as a cleaner at a massive old office building downtown. It was a relic from the 1920s, with tall marble columns, brass fixtures, and winding staircases that creaked no matter how lightly you stepped. By day, it was bustling with people in suits and heels clattering across the tiled floors. But at night, it was a different world. Empty, dark, and silent, the building felt almost alive, as if it were watching and waiting. On her third night, Lily started noticing things she couldn't explain. The building's air conditioning had been broken since she started, so the halls were always warm and stagnant. But sometimes she'd turn a corner and walk into an icy cold spot, like she'd passed through a wall of freezing air. And then there were the shadows. Places in the building that should have been empty but seemed to have strange looming shapes lurking in the corners, just at the edge of her vision. The worst was the 13th floor. Officially, there wasn't a 13th floor on the elevator panel. The building's design had skipped the number, as many older buildings did. But one night, as she was cleaning the 12th floor, the elevator doors suddenly opened, unbidden, to an unmarked pitch-black hallway, a floor that shouldn't exist. Feeling a chill of dread, Lily took a step toward it, as if in a trance, but something in her gut screamed at her to stay back. She hit the close button, breathing heavily as the doors slid shut. She told herself she must have imagined it. There couldn't be a 13th floor. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was watching her as the elevator descended. A few nights later, her supervisor casually mentioned a rule she hadn't heard before. Whatever you do, don't take the stairs between midnight and 3 a.m., and if you hear anything strange, ignore it. She laughed it off, thinking it was some kind of initiation prank, but her supervisor's face was deadly serious. This building has history. Just stay out of the stairwell, okay? Lily didn't argue, but her curiosity was piqued. Why would they warn her to stay away from the stairs? That night, around 1 a.m., she heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound, echoing from the stairwell, like someone walking up slowly. The noise grew louder, more deliberate, coming closer to her floor. Unable to resist, she tiptoed down the hallway and pushed the stairwell door open just a crack, peering through. The stairwell was dark, lit only by a dim emergency light on each landing. She could hear the tapping getting closer, echoing up the stairs like footsteps against metal. But she couldn't see anyone. Then she noticed something strange. The sound wasn't coming from below, but from above, descending toward her. Her heart pounded as the footsteps grew louder, until they were nearly on top of her. She held her breath, keeping the door barely cracked open when she caught sight of something on the landing above. A figure, pale and unnaturally tall, was standing just out of reach of the light. It wore an old-fashioned suit, like something from decades ago, and its face was obscured by shadows. The only thing she could make out was its mouth, a wide, unnatural grin stretched too far across its face, teeth gleaming even in the dark. The figure tilted its head slowly as if listening and took a step down closer to her. She felt frozen in place, unable to move or look away. She watched as it descended, one slow, deliberate step at a time until it reached her floor. It stopped, still partially hidden in the shadows, but now close enough that she could see its eyes, cold, black, and staring directly at her. "Are you lost?" it whispered, its voice low and raspy, filled with something that sounded almost like amusement. She slammed the door shut and backed away, her heart racing. She didn't dare turn her back on the stairwell, her eyes fixed on the door as she stumbled back to her cleaning cart. But just as she turned to run, the door slowly creaked open, and the figure stepped into the hallway. Lily bolted, her footsteps echoing down the hall as she dashed toward the elevator. She could hear it following her, its steps slow and measured, like it knew she couldn't escape. She reached the elevator, frantically pressing the button, praying it would open in time. The doors finally slid open, and she threw herself inside, hitting the button for the lobby. As the doors began to close, she caught a final glimpse of the figure, standing at the end of the hall, grinning, its head tilted in that same curious way, watching her with those empty, dark eyes. She stumbled out of the elevator in the lobby, breathing heavily. She didn't know what to tell her supervisor. Who would believe her? She could barely believe it herself. But when she gathered the courage to mention it the next day, her supervisor just nodded slowly. "You saw him, didn't you?" she asked quietly, her face pale. "That was Mr. Monroe. He was one of the building's original architects. Died in an accident here decades ago, or at least, that's the story. But he never really left." From that night on, Lily avoided the stairs entirely, choosing to take the service elevator, even when it meant waiting longer or walking an extra floor. But every now and then she'd hear those footsteps echoing in the stairwell as she cleaned, that slow, steady rhythm tapping against the concrete, coming closer and closer, like Mr. Monroe was waiting, watching. And every time she heard it, that familiar chill would creep over her, and she'd remember the feeling of those cold, empty eyes fixed on her, his mouth stretched into that impossible knowing grin. Ryan had been working nights as a delivery driver for years, but his route always kept him on edge when he hit the outskirts of town. At the far end of his nightly drive was an abandoned property known by locals as the Old Bramble Estate. Overgrown and forgotten, the house sat back off a narrow dirt road surrounded by thick trees that always seemed to loom, bending in impossible directions, casting dark, twisted shadows. The estate had been empty for decades, and rumors swirled that the previous owners had vanished without a trace one night in the 1970s, leaving behind half-finished meals and rooms full of untouched belongings. On a particularly cold and foggy night, Ryan's last delivery took him dangerously close to the estate. The fog had settled in thick waves and his headlights barely cut through the murk. He'd usually speed past the dirt road without even glancing at it, but tonight was different. Tonight, he saw something that made his stomach drop. A light. A single, dim light flickered in one of the upper windows of the old mansion. It was impossible. He'd passed this place countless times and the power lines had been cut off years ago. He told himself it was a trick of the fog or maybe the reflection of his headlights, but curiosity got the better of him. He pulled his car to the side of the road, debating whether to investigate or drive away. Against his better judgment, he grabbed his flashlight, leaving his car and crossing the twisted trees and dense undergrowth toward the house. The air grew colder as he approached, each step feeling heavier than the last. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking open when he gave it the slightest push. Inside, everything was coated in dust, frozen in time, as though the owners had only just left. Faded family photos still hung on the walls, and the living room was arranged with antique furniture covered in a layer of grime. The silence was overwhelming, thick and unnatural, pressing down on him as he moved deeper into the house. Then he heard it, a soft, rhythmic thumping coming from upstairs. Ryan froze, the hair on his arms standing on end. It sounded like someone was pacing back and forth, their steps slow and deliberate. Every instinct told him to turn around, get back in his car, and leave. But some twisted sense of curiosity pushed him forward. He took the stairs, each step creaking under his weight as he followed the sound. The hallway upstairs was long and dark, lined with closed doors on either side. The faint light he'd seen from the road flickered from the last room on the left, casting a dull, yellowish glow under the door. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and pushed the door open. The room was a child's bedroom, frozen in time like the rest of the house. Toys lay scattered across the floor, and a small bed was tucked in the corner with a thin, dusty blanket. And there, in the middle of the room, was the source of the light, a small antique lantern flickering on the floor. But what made Ryan's blood run cold was the child. A boy no older than 7 or 8 sat on the floor next to the lantern. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were wide and hollow, staring intently at something in his small hands. Ryan took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest, but the boy seemed oblivious to his presence. He was mumbling something under his breath, over and over, a strange, garbled whisper that Ryan couldn't understand. Are you okay?" Ryan managed to stammer, his voice shaking. The boy stopped mumbling, his head jerking up, his hollow eyes locking onto Ryan with a piercing intensity. He held up what was in his hands, a small, cracked porcelain doll with a faded smile. The boy's gaze was unblinking, cold, as he tilted his head and whispered, "She wants you to stay." Before Ryan could react, he felt a sudden, sharp chill rush over him, freezing him in place. The door behind him slammed shut, and the lantern's flame flickered wildly, casting strange, shifting shadows across the room. The boy's face twisted into a grin, one that stretched too wide, too unnatural for his small frame. His eyes seemed to darken, hollow pits of nothingness, as he stood up. The doll clutched tightly in his small hands. The room grew darker, the walls seeming to close in around Ryan. He tried to move, to reach for the door, but it was as though he were rooted to the spot. The boy took a step toward him, the doll's cracked face staring up at him with a fixed, sinister smile. Then, from somewhere deeper in the house, another voice echoed up the stairs. A woman's voice, low and crooning, singing a strange, lilting melody that sent shivers down his spine. It grew louder, closer, filling the hallway outside the door, and he could hear the sound of footsteps approaching, slow and heavy. "Mommy's coming?" the boy whispered, his smile widening as he turned toward the door, his hollow eyes gleaming with dark delight. "You have to stay. She's been waiting for you." The doorknob twisted slowly, creaking as it opened, revealing a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. Ryan's heart pounded, his breath hitching as the figure stepped into the room, her face hidden in shadow, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. She reached out one hand, bony and claw-like, her fingers stretching toward him. Panicking, Ryan wrenched his feet free from whatever invisible force held him in place. He darted toward the window, throwing it open without a second thought. He barely remembered the jump, only the feeling of cold air rushing past him as he landed awkwardly in the overgrown grass outside, stumbling as he scrambled to his feet. He didn't look back as he ran to his car, his heart racing, breaths coming in ragged gasps. He threw himself inside, locking the doors and speeding down the road without looking back. The image of the boy and his hollow, dead eyes seared into his mind. Later that night, as he lay in bed trying to shake the memory, his phone buzzed with a notification. A text message from an unknown number. It read simply, "You left her waiting." He deleted the message, telling himself it was a prank, a glitch. But every night since then, at precisely 2:13 a.m., he receives the same message. He changed his number, his phone, his entire routine, but the messages keep coming every night without fail. And in the quiet hours just before dawn, he sometimes hears the faint sound of a child's whisper just outside his window, asking why he left and begging him to come back. Mara took the night shift at the Starlight Motel because she needed extra cash, but she quickly regretted it. The Starlight sat at the edge of town, a rundown relic from the 1950s with peeling paint, flickering neon lights, and a reputation for attracting unusual guests. Most people avoided it, calling it the Deadlight Motel. But Mara didn't believe in local ghost stories, chalking them up to small-town superstitions and bored teenagers. She'd work, get paid, and go home. That was all she cared about. The motel was nearly always empty, and her job was quiet, too quiet. Most nights, she'd do a few rounds around the lobby, read a book, and watch the security monitors. But on her second night, something strange happened. A man checked in, pale and exhausted looking, carrying a single small bag. He didn't speak much, barely looked at her as he took his room key and shuffled off down the hallway to room 7. She thought nothing of it, but a few hours later, around 2 a.m., she heard a faint knocking sound echoing through the lobby. She looked up, expecting to see the man from room 7 coming back, but the lobby was empty. The knock continued, soft but persistent, seeming to come from the hallway. Thinking it might be the pipes or an animal outside, she ignored it, but the noise only grew louder. Finally, she stood and made her way down the hall toward the sound, her footsteps echoing in the quiet as she approached room 7. The door was slightly ajar, which sent a chill down her spine. She knew she'd locked it after he'd checked in. "Hello?" she called softly, feeling a strange sense of dread as she pushed the door open wider. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight, and an odd, stale smell lingered in the air. She fumbled for the light switch, but when she flicked it on, the room was empty. There was no sign of the man. No luggage, no bed disturbed, no belongings at all. It was as if he had never been there. Only a key lay on the bedside table, a small, rusted key that looked nothing like the ones she'd handed out at the front desk. Confused, she picked up the key and turned it over in her hand. It was heavy and cold, its edges worn smooth. She tried to shake off the unease crawling up her spine, but a whisper drifted through the empty room, chilling her blood. "Leave." Mara dropped the key, her pulse racing as she backed out of the room. She closed the door firmly and hurried back to the lobby, convincing herself it was just her imagination. The night wore on, and she tried to focus on her book, but her eyes kept flicking back to the monitor showing the hallway outside room 7. At precisely 3 a.m., the screen flickered, static crackling across it, and in the middle of the static, she saw the man from room 7 standing perfectly still, his face expressionless, staring directly into the camera. His eyes were empty, dark pools, staring straight through the screen and into her. She blinked, and he was gone, replaced by static. She took a shaky breath, telling herself she was tired, imagining things. The next night, Mara resolved to ignore room 7. But as the clock struck 2 a.m., the knocking started again, louder this time, insistent. The sounds seemed to be coming from everywhere, the walls, the ceiling, even the floors. It echoed through the empty motel, rhythmic and unnatural, like a heartbeat. She gritted her teeth, refusing to leave the lobby, but suddenly the lights began to flicker, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. And then she heard it. A voice, low and raspy, whispering her name from the hallway. "Mara, come back." A cold sweat broke out across her skin. She glanced at the monitor. The camera feed was clear, the hallway empty, but the whisper continued, louder, more insistent, growing into a cacophony of voices, all calling her name, beckoning her to return to room 7. Unable to resist, She grabbed her flashlight and stepped into the hallway, her heart pounding as she moved toward room 7. The air was frigid, colder than it should have been, and a smell of decay filled her nose, growing stronger with every step. When she reached the door, she stopped, hesitating, but the whispers continued, swirling around her, pulling her toward the door. With trembling hands, she pushed it open. The room was dark, the smell overpowering, and as she shone her flashlight inside, she nearly screamed. The man from the night before was there, lying on the bed, his face twisted in terror, his eyes wide and unseeing. His mouth was open in a silent scream, and his skin was cold and pale, his body still as stone. And then she noticed something even more chilling, a faint, ghostly figure standing beside the bed, watching her. It was the man's doppelganger, an exact replica, staring at her with those same dark, empty eyes, a cold smile stretching across its face. Before she could turn to run, it spoke in that same raspy voice, its tone dripping with malice. "You'll stay, won't you, Mara?" The flashlight flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. She bolted, her footsteps pounding down the hallway as the whispers followed her, filling the air with laughter with promises that she would return. She burst into the lobby, not stopping until she was outside, her breath visible in the cold night air. She didn't look back as she ran to her car, starting it with shaking hands, and sped away from the Starlight Motel, vowing never to return. The next day, Mara quit her job, but as she was packing up her things, her phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced down, her heart sinking as she read the text message from an unknown number. "Room 7 is waiting." Since then, she's changed her number, moved to a new town, and avoided anything to do with the Starlight Motel. But every few nights, just after midnight, she'll hear that soft, insistent knocking somewhere in her apartment, against the walls, her closet door, even her window, even though she lives on the 3rd floor. And on particularly dark, silent nights, she swears she can hear the voices again, calling her name, begging her to return to the room that waits for her, where the light flickers and where the whispers never stop.